The link between yield and spot rates. Recall that the bond pricing framework is as follows. We project the future cash flows, and then we discount these cash flows at the appropriate required rate of return. Now with bonds, we refer to those required rate of return as yield. And the bond's yield itself can be broken down into two components. First, we look at what the yield is on Treasury securities, because this reflects the risk-free rate. And then we add a spread to reflect any credit or liquidity risk that's inherent in the underlying bond that we're trying to value. So when it comes to picking benchmark rates, there's two varieties that may be used. The first benchmark rate would be the yield to maturity on the Treasury itself. And this is the weighted average yield over the entire term of the bond. So if the bond's term is 5 years, we would pick the 5-year yield to maturity. And what that 5-year yield to maturity reflects is the weighted average required return over that entire period. So you're using the same average 5-year rate to discount all these future cash flows. But a lot of traders would have a problem with that, ladies and gentlemen. And let me do a little thought experiment with you. Suppose you have two cash flows, one occurring a year from now, one occurring 10 years from now. And at the same time, assume they're treasuries, so there's no default whatsoever. And if I asked you, would you require the same rate of return on the 1 year as you would on the 10-year? Most people would say no. Most people would say I'd probably require a higher return on the 10-year cash flow than the 1-year cash flow. Because with 10 years out, that just creates a lot more uncertainty. It's got greater duration, etc. I'm more exposed to risk, so I require a higher return on that 10th cash flow rather than the first one. And that's exactly what spot rate says. So spot rate says, rather than using the same average yield to discount all the cash flows, spot says the yield for each individual cash flow must be different. So as I demonstrated, the first cash flow would be discounted by the 1-year spot. The 10th cash flow would be discounted at the 10-year spot, which would be something different than the 1-year spot. Let's do an illustration. Suppose we're valuing a 4-year corporate bond and we need a benchmark discount rate for the 4 cash flows. So we can use the same weighted average discount rate for all the cash flows. That would be the yield, or the yield to maturity benchmark. Or we can use a unique discount rate for each cash flow. These would be the spots. So here's a visual of what we're discussing. So there it is. That's your 4-year maturity bond that we're looking at. Now, if you're using yield as your benchmark, we just need to know what the 4-year yield is. In other words, just give me the average for over the 4 years. But if you're using spots, notice how we're using a unique discount rate for each cash flow. And I'll give you a good analogy. Suppose that we had a classroom that had 4 students, and I asked you to describe this class that has 4 students. The first way you can describe this class is just by giving me the average for the class. So that one average represents the average of all those 4 students. But the more proper way to describe your class is by showing the individual scores of all 4 students. So mathematically they're linked, because even with the classroom analogy, the class average is a function of the 4 individual observations. And it's the same thing here. As we will demonstrate in subsequent modules, the 4-year yield, which is an average, is actually the weighted average of these individual spot rates. Now tip, these are benchmark treasury yields. In other words, they're risk-free rates. So when we talk about yield curve, term structure, we're talking about the rate that's available on treasuries, and treasuries are risk-free. On the other hand, to calculate the yield for corporate bonds, we would have to add a spread to reflect credit and liquidity risk, as we demonstrated earlier.